Darkness. Not the darkness you know. Not the comfortable obscurity of a bedroom at night, where streetlights leak through curtains and digital clocks glow green. Not the darkness broken by a single switch, a casual flick of fingers that floods a room with luminescence so reliable you've forgotten to be grateful for it. No. The darkness of 1878 was something else entirely. It was absolute. It was suffocating. It was dangerous. It was a living, breathing predator that consumed 12 hours of every human day, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Imagine a world where sunset meant imprisonment. Where factories went silent as the sun dipped below the horizon, not because workers needed rest, but because human eyes simply could not function in the void that followed. Where surgeons refused to operate after 4 in the afternoon because shadows meant death on the operating table. Where children stopped learning, where lovers stopped reading poetry, where humanity itself simply stopped. When the earth turned its face away from the sun, the night belonged to fire. Candles, oil lamps, gas flames that hissed and flickered and filled lungs with toxins. Fire that could burn down entire city blocks in minutes. Fire that killed thousands every year. Fire that cost a working family a quarter of their weekly wages just to push back the darkness for a few precious hours. The rich could afford more candles, better oil, safer lamps. The poor sat in darkness, their children's eyes straining over books in dim, wavering light that damaged their vision permanently. Darkness was a tax on poverty, an enforcer of inequality, a prison with invisible bars. Manhattan in the late 19th century was a city of 8 million flames. Every night, as dusk descended, lamplighters would emerge like soldiers going to battle, moving from street lamp to street lamp, touching flame to gas, creating rivers of light that did almost nothing to illuminate the streets below. The gas was unreliable. The flames went out in wind. The posts were spaced so far apart that entire stretches of avenue remained cloaked in shadow, where muggers waited, where women refused to walk alone, where the police themselves feared to patrol. Inside homes, the ritual was the same. Strike match. Light candle. Watch the small flame struggle against the enormous darkness. Read by its glow and feel your eyes burn, your head ache, your spine curve forward in an attempt to catch just a little more light. Wealthy families had gas lights installed in their homes, pipes running through walls like veins, feeding flames in ornate fixtures. But gas was expensive. Gas leaked. Gas exploded. Gas killed families in their sleep, a silent, odorless murderer that crept through homes like a ghost. In New York alone, gas explosions claimed hundreds of lives each year. You could smell it sometimes, that faint rotten egg warning, and you'd pray. You'd pray and open windows and hope you'd wake up in the morning. Factories were tombs of lost potential. Textile mills, steel foundries, manufacturing plants, all of them governed by the tyranny of the sun. Work began at dawn. Work ended when natural light faded. Gaslight was too expensive for most factory owners, too dangerous around machinery and combustible materials. And so productivity simply stopped. Half the day gone. Half of human potential unrealized, not because workers lacked will or skill, but because the world went dark. The Industrial Revolution was happening, yes, but it was happening in chains, shackled to the ancient rhythm of sunrise and sunset that had governed humanity since the beginning of time. Think of the hospitals. Think of the doctors who turned away emergency cases after dark because the risk was too great. Think of the surgeons who operated by candlelight and gaslight, shadows dancing across open wounds, instruments glinting and disappearing in the flicker, hands moving with desperate certainty through a darkness that claimed as many patients as disease itself. Think of the mothers giving birth in the night, screaming in rooms where midwives could barely see, where complications went unnoticed until it was too late, where darkness was another form of death. The streets at night were battlegrounds. Crime flourished in shadow. Assault, robbery, murder, all of it made easy by the simple fact that no one could see. Police carried lanterns that announced their presence from blocks away, giving criminals ample time to vanish into the dark. Women planned their lives around daylight. Children were kept indoors after sunset, not just for safety, but because there was simply nothing to do in the dark except sit and wait for morning. And yet people accepted this. They had to. Darkness was a fact of nature, as immutable as gravity, as inevitable as death. Humanity had tried for centuries to push it back. We'd burned whale oil until whales nearly went extinct. We'd drilled for petroleum and distilled kerosene, filling our homes with lamps that could explode at the slightest tip, that poisoned the air we breathed, that covered our walls in black soot. We'd piped gas through our cities, creating networks of potential disaster that occasionally fulfilled their promise in spectacular, deadly fashion. We tried everything we could think of, and still, darkness won. Every single night, darkness won. Some scientists were working on electric light. Arc lamps existed, massive, brilliant, brutal things that could light up an entire block with a searing white glare that hurt the eyes and droned with a deep, unsettling hum. They were used in lighthouses and large public spaces, but they were completely impractical for homes. Too bright. Too hot. Too expensive. They required enormous amounts of power and burned through carbon rods in hours. Electric light seemed like a dead end, a promising idea that would never scale to human needs. In 1878, the world stood at the edge of transformation and didn't know it. The problem wasn't vision. Everyone could see the problem. Everyone understood that humanity needed light. The problem was that no one could solve it. Not practically. Not affordably. Not safely. The challenge was so immense, so layered with technical complexity, that most scientists had simply given up. To create electric light that could work in a home, you needed several miracles happening simultaneously. First, you needed a material that could glow when electricity passed through it, but that wouldn't instantly burn up in the presence of oxygen. Second, you needed that material to last not for hours, but for hundreds of hours. Third, you needed to make this light affordable enough that ordinary people could use it. Fourth, you needed to create an entire system of power generation and distribution that didn't exist yet. And fifth, you needed to do all of this better, cheaper, and safer than gas, which had the advantage of decades of infrastructure and investment behind it. Dozens of brilliant minds had tried and failed. Joseph Swan in England had been working on incandescent bulbs for 20 years and had achieved some success, but his bulbs burned out too quickly and required powerful, expensive batteries. Hiram Maxim was attempting his own version, backed by substantial financial resources, but was running into the same fundamental problems. The scientific community was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, this particular problem was unsolvable. That electric light would remain a laboratory curiosity, a beautiful theory that couldn't survive contact with reality. And then there was Thomas Alva Edison. Not yet a legend. Not yet the Wizard of Menlo Park in popular imagination. Just a man. A 31-year-old inventor who had already made a fortune improving the telegraph and phonograph, who was known for his persistence and his showmanship in equal measure. A man with a 6th-grade education who taught himself chemistry and physics from library books. A man who was partially deaf from childhood, who had learned to read lips, who had turned his disability into a gift by making him immune to distraction. A man who rarely slept more than 4 hours a night, who could work for days at a time on pure obsession, fueled by coffee and the addictive rush of discovery. But here's what the history books often forget. Edison was also difficult. Stubborn to the point of madness. Quick to take credit, slow to share it. He could be cruel to subordinates who disappointed him, cold to family members who demanded his attention, ruthless to competitors who threatened his patents. He was a complicated, flawed human being whose greatness came not from some innate genius, but from an almost pathological inability to accept defeat. Where others saw impossibility, Edison saw a puzzle that simply hadn't been solved yet. Where others saw failure, Edison saw data. In September 1878, Edison visited William Wallace's brass and copper factory in Connecticut, where he witnessed a demonstration of arc lights powered by dynamos. Something ignited in his mind that night. Not inspiration exactly. Inspiration is too romantic a word. What Edison experienced was recognition. He looked at those harsh, brilliant arc lamps and saw not what they were, but what they could become. He saw millions of lights in millions of homes. He saw a world transformed. And crucially, he saw how to make money from it. Edison had a gift that separated him from pure scientists. He didn't just invent things for the sake of knowledge. He invented things that could be manufactured, sold, and integrated into people's lives. He thought in systems. While other inventors were focused on creating a better light bulb, Edison immediately understood that a light bulb without an electrical system to power it was meaningless. He would need to invent everything at once. The bulb, the power station, the distribution network, the meters, the switches, the sockets, the entire infrastructure of electrical power. He would need to not just solve a technical problem, but create an industry that didn't exist. On September 15th, he made a public announcement that shocked the scientific community and terrified the gas industry. He claimed he could create a system of electric lighting that would make gas obsolete. He was so confident that he hadn't even begun serious experimentation yet. He was making promises before he'd solved a single technical challenge. The press loved it. The gas company stocks plummeted. Scientists rolled their eyes. Edison had always been a showman, prone to exaggeration, brilliant at generating publicity that would attract investors and put pressure on competitors. But this time he'd made a mistake. This time he'd promised something he wasn't certain he could deliver. And the weight of that promise would nearly destroy him. He assembled a team at his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Not just any team, but the best experimenters and craftsmen he could find. Charles Batchelor, his chief assistant, a man whose hands could build anything Edison's mind could imagine. Francis Upton, a Princeton-educated mathematician who could handle the theoretical work Edison lacked patience for. John Cruacy, a Swiss machinist who could fabricate experimental equipment with microscopic precision. And dozens of others, a small army of minds and hands, all focused on a single goal: create a practical incandescent lamp. They started with what everyone else had tried: platinum wire. It was the obvious choice. Platinum could handle heat, could glow brightly, wouldn't oxidize. Edison pumped the air out of glass bulbs to create a vacuum, sealed platinum wires inside, ran current through them. They glowed. They worked. For about 10 minutes. Then they burned out. He tried thicker platinum wire. It lasted longer but didn't glow bright enough. Thinner wire glowed brightly but burned out even faster. He tried coating the platinum. He tried alloying it. He tried hundreds of variations. Nothing worked. The newspapers that had celebrated his announcement in September were mocking him by December. Edison's electric light is a magnificent failure, one editorial proclaimed. Stock prices in his company were falling. Investors were getting nervous. The gas industry was celebrating, their stocks recovering, their monopoly secure. And in his laboratory in Menlo Park, Thomas Edison was discovering what it meant to be wrong. Publicly. Expensively. Repeatedly. Winter came to New Jersey. Snow covered the grounds of the laboratory. Inside, the pace intensified. Edison drove his team relentlessly, sometimes working 72 hours straight, catnapping on a workbench with his coat as a pillow, waking and immediately resuming experiments. His wife Mary complained she never saw him anymore. His children barely recognized him when he came home. He didn't care. Or more accurately, he couldn't stop. The obsession had him completely now. This wasn't just about invention anymore. This was about proving everyone wrong. About validating his public claims. About ego and reputation and the terror that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found a problem he couldn't solve. Platinum was abandoned. Too expensive anyway. Even if it worked, no one could afford platinum light bulbs. He needed something cheaper, something ordinary. Carbon. It was an old idea. Others had tried carbon filaments before and failed. But Edison approached it differently. He didn't just try one type of carbon. He tried everything. Carbonized paper. Carbonized wood. Carbonized thread. Carbonized fishing line. Carbonized every plant fiber he could find. He sent men around the world to collect samples. Bamboo from Japan. Palm fibers from Cuba. Cotton from Egypt. His laboratory became a museum of materials, hundreds of jars and boxes filled with specimens waiting to be carbonized, tested, and usually discarded. Each experiment required precision work. The carbon filament had to be mounted delicately in a glass bulb. The air had to be pumped out to create a vacuum, otherwise the carbon would simply burn up in seconds when exposed to oxygen. Then the bulb had to be sealed. Then current had to be carefully applied, slowly increased, while someone watched with a stopwatch to see how long the filament would last. Sometimes seconds. Sometimes minutes. Very occasionally an hour. Then the bulb would flicker and die, and they'd write down the results and start again. 1,000 attempts. That's the number that would become legend. 1,000 failures. But that number doesn't capture the reality. It doesn't convey the grinding, soul-crushing tedium of repetitive failure. It doesn't communicate the moments when Edison would stare at a burned-out bulb and wonder if he was chasing something impossible. It doesn't express the pressure from investors, the mockery from newspapers, the doubt from his own team members who were too polite to say out loud what they were thinking, that maybe this time, Edison had promised too much. His partner, Francis Upton, wrote letters home describing the increasingly desperate atmosphere. The tension in the laboratory. Edison's fraying temper. The sense that they were running out of time and options. Money was running low. Investors were pulling back. The entire enterprise was beginning to feel like an expensive folly, a monument to one man's inability to admit defeat. But here's the thing about Edison that separated him from almost everyone else. He didn't see these experiments as failures. Not really. Years later he would say, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." It's become a cliché now, that quote, printed on motivational posters and embroidered on throw pillows. But in that moment, in the cold winter of 1879, it wasn't inspirational. It was barely believable. It was the desperate mantra of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that persistence would eventually be rewarded. He refined the vacuum pump, making it more efficient, pulling more air out of the bulbs. He experimented with different gases, wondering if a trace amount of something might actually help instead of hurt. He adjusted voltages, tested different electrical configurations, rebuilt circuits. He made improvements to every part of the system except the one thing that mattered most. He still didn't have a filament that would last. His health deteriorated. The lack of sleep, the stress, the constant exposure to chemical fumes in the laboratory. He developed a persistent cough. His eyes were bloodshot. He lost weight. His wife begged him to rest. His doctor warned him he was courting a breakdown. He ignored them all. Because stopping meant admitting failure. Stopping meant returning money to investors. Stopping meant validation for every scientist who'd said it couldn't be done. Stopping meant the darkness would win. In the spring of 1879, 9 months after his bold announcement, Edison tried carbonized cotton thread. Not because he thought it would work particularly well, but because he was running out of materials to try. The first tests were unremarkable. The thread burned out quickly just like everything else. But something about it interested him. The way it failed was different. More consistent. More predictable. He kept refining the process. Adjusting the carbonization temperature. Altering the thickness of the thread. Improving the vacuum in the bulb. And then, in April 1879, he got one to last 12 hours. 12 hours. It was still not enough for a commercial product. You couldn't sell a light bulb that burned out after half a day. But it was progress. Real, measurable progress. For the first time in months, Edison felt hope instead of desperation. 12 hours meant the principle worked. It meant that somewhere in the infinite universe of possible variations, there was a solution. You just had to find it. The team doubled down on cotton thread. They tested different threads, different carbonization methods, different mounting techniques. Slowly, painfully, the numbers crept upward. 14 hours. 20 hours. 40 hours. Each improvement required dozens of experiments, weeks of work. But they were moving in the right direction now. The finish line was visible, even if it was still impossibly far away. Summer arrived, and with it, a new kind of torture. The laboratory had no air conditioning, no fans powerful enough to cool the space. The furnaces needed to carbonize materials made everything worse. Men worked in their undershirts, sweat dripping onto workbenches, staining notebooks, making their hands slip on delicate glass bulbs. The smell was overwhelming. Burning carbon, chemical vapors, unwashed bodies, the ozone scent of electrical discharge. Edison seemed not to notice. Or perhaps he noticed and simply didn't care. His focus had narrowed to a single point. Everything else, his health, his family, his finances, all of it was secondary to the problem. The problem consumed him. He had become less a man and more a machine designed for a single purpose: to make light. His competitors weren't idle. Hiram Maxim was making progress with his own bulb designs, backed by substantial funding from the United States Electric Lighting Company. Joseph Swan in England was filing patents and giving demonstrations. The race was on, and Edison was no longer the clear favorite. Some investors jumped ship entirely, moving their money to rival ventures that seemed more likely to succeed. Edison's company stock was nearly worthless. If he didn't produce results soon, he would be bankrupt. Not just professionally ruined, but financially destroyed. Everything he'd built, every dollar he'd made from previous inventions, all of it was being poured into this single obsessive quest. His relationship with his wife Mary deteriorated into silence. She had married an inventor, yes, but also a man who came home, who spoke to his children, who existed in the normal world of domestic life. That man had vanished. The person who occasionally appeared at the house was a ghost, distracted, distant, his mind always at the laboratory even when his body was sitting at the dinner table. His daughter Marion would later write in her diary about the stranger her father had become during those months. "He looks at us," she wrote, "but does not see us. He is somewhere else. Somewhere we cannot follow." The laboratory itself was beginning to feel like a prison. The same faces, the same walls, the same endless cycle of hope and disappointment. Some team members quit. The constant failure was too much. They'd signed up to work with the great Thomas Edison, to be part of history, and instead found themselves trapped in what felt increasingly like a very expensive exercise in futility. Those who remained did so out of loyalty or stubbornness, or because they'd invested too much time to walk away now. The sunk cost fallacy applied to human ambition. October came. Edison was carbonizing everything now. Not systematically but desperately. Cedar shavings, coconut hair, cork, hickory, a piece of his own fishing rod, bamboo from a fan in his office. He wasn't following scientific method anymore. He was thrashing, trying anything, everything. The orderly notebooks that had characterized his early experiments gave way to scattered notes, incoherent sketches, the documentation of a mind approaching its breaking point. And then, on the evening of October 19, 1879, something happened that would change everything. Not because Edison was brilliant in that moment, but because he was tired. Because his hands were shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep. Because he was coiling a piece of carbonized cotton thread between his fingers, absent-mindedly, not even part of an experiment, just nervous energy seeking an outlet. And the thread didn't break. Usually, carbonized thread was incredibly fragile. The slightest pressure would shatter it. But this particular thread, carbonized at this particular temperature for this particular length of time, had a tensile strength that surprised him. He stopped, looked at the thread in his hands, felt its texture, its flexibility. Something in his exhausted mind clicked. Not inspiration, recognition. This thread felt different. He called for a bulb, mounted the filament with trembling fingers, sealed it, connected it to the power source. Someone turned down the gas lamps in the laboratory. Edison touched wire to terminal. The bulb glowed, soft, steady, beautiful. Not the harsh glare of arc lamps, but warm, gentle illumination that looked like bottled sunshine. Everyone in the laboratory stopped working, gathered around, watching, waiting for it to fail like all the others. 1 hour passed. 2, 3. Men started taking shifts, watching the bulb in rotations, sleeping on benches, waking to check if it was still burning. Dawn came and the bulb was still glowing. Edison hadn't slept. Didn't dare. As if sleeping might break whatever fragile magic was happening. Morning turned to afternoon. Afternoon to evening. 40 hours. 50. The bulb burned on. Someone had to say it out loud. Charles Batchelor, his oldest friend and closest confidant, the man who had stood by him through all of this, finally whispered it. "I think we've done it, Tom." Edison didn't respond. Didn't celebrate. He just stared at the glowing bulb with an expression that wasn't quite joy, wasn't quite relief. It was something deeper. Vindication. Validation. The proof that his obsession hadn't been madness. That persistence, however brutal, however costly, could eventually bend reality to human will. The bulb lasted more than 13 hours before the filament finally failed. 13.5 hours of continuous light. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't ready for market. But it was proof of concept. It was evidence that the problem could be solved. And more importantly, Edison now understood the principles. He knew what made this filament work when others failed. He could replicate it, improve it, scale it. But he didn't announce it. Not yet. Because 13 hours still wasn't enough. He needed hundreds of hours. He needed durability. He needed reliability. So he took what he'd learned and kept experimenting. The mood in the laboratory transformed overnight. The oppressive weight of despair lifted. Men who had been considering quitting suddenly found new energy. They weren't failing anymore. They were iterating, improving, moving toward a goal they could now actually see. Edison tried different types of cotton thread, different carbonization temperatures, different vacuum levels. Each variable adjusted, tested, measured, recorded. The scientific method restored. The hours of bulb life kept increasing. 20 hours. 50. 100. By December he had bulbs lasting over 150 hours. Still not enough, but getting closer. And then one of his assistants returned from a trip to Japan with samples of bamboo. Bamboo fibers, when carbonized, proved stronger than cotton thread. More flexible. More durable. The first bamboo filament bulb lasted over 200 hours. And Edison knew finally that he had it. He had the solution. He had the future in a glass bulb. On December 31, 1879, New Year's Eve, Edison staged a public demonstration. He strung electric lights throughout his laboratory and the surrounding grounds. He invited reporters, investors, the general public. 3,000 people made the journey to Menlo Park that night, arriving by train, by carriage, on foot through the winter darkness. They came with skepticism. They'd heard Edison's promises before. The newspapers had been full of his claims and his failures. Most expected another disappointment. Another exhibition of interesting but impractical technology. But as the sun set and darkness fell over New Jersey, Edison threw the switches. And suddenly, impossibly, Menlo Park was bathed in light. Not harsh gaslight. Not the blinding glare of arc lamps. But warm, steady, gentle electric light streaming from dozens of bulbs in the laboratory, in the streets, in the surrounding buildings. 3,000 people stood in the winter night and stared at artificial sunshine. Some gasped. Some applauded. Some simply stood in silence, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. The end of something. The beginning of something else. A reporter from the New York Herald wrote, "The laboratory was illuminated by 25 lamps and the office by 8. The entire system was explained in detail by Mr. Edison and his assistants. The light was soft, mellow, and grateful to the eye. It seemed almost like writing by daylight. Grateful to the eye." That phrase captured something essential. This wasn't just technological achievement. This was light that felt human. Light you could live with. Light that transformed space without overwhelming it. The demonstration ran for 3 hours. In that time, not a single bulb failed. The crowd grew larger as word spread through nearby towns. The trains brought more people. By midnight, there were over 5,000 spectators. They walked the grounds, examining the lights, touching the bulbs gently, trying to understand the mechanism. Edison held court like a prophet who had finally been vindicated, explaining the system, demonstrating the switches, the meters, the generators. He was charming, eloquent, the showman in him fully activated. This was his moment. All the suffering, all the failure, all the mockery, it all evaporated in the glow of those bulbs. But even in that moment of triumph, Edison understood something others didn't. The light bulb was just the beginning. The real work was just starting. Because a light bulb without an electrical infrastructure was worthless. He needed to create power stations, distribution networks, wiring standards, meters to measure usage, prices affordable enough for ordinary people. He needed to transform not just technology but society itself. He needed to convince cities to rip out their gas systems and replace them with something that didn't yet exist at scale. He needed to train electricians, establish safety codes, secure permits, fight legal battles, navigate political systems. The invention was one thing. Building an industry was something else entirely. The world didn't change overnight. Despite the successful demonstration, gas companies fought back viciously. They spread rumors about electric light. They claimed it was dangerous, that it would burn down houses, that it would damage people's eyesight. They had politicians in their pockets, decades of infrastructure investment, armies of workers dependent on gas systems for their livelihoods. Edison wasn't just competing with gas. He was threatening an entire economic ecosystem that had no intention of going quietly into obsolescence. He opened his first commercial power station on Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan in September 1882, 3 years after that first successful bulb. It was a massive undertaking. He had to excavate streets to lay electrical cables, convince building owners to install wiring, train crews to connect homes and businesses. The first system powered just 400 lamps in 85 buildings. But it worked. And slowly, building by building, street by street, the electric grid began to spread. Within a year, over 500 customers were connected. Within 5 years, that number was in the thousands. The darkness was retreating. Not everywhere. Not yet. But retreating. The impact rippled outward in ways Edison hadn't fully anticipated. Factories could now operate 24 hours a day. Productivity doubled, then tripled. Manufacturing centers that had been dark and silent at night became hives of continuous activity. The Industrial Revolution, which had been constrained by daylight, suddenly broke free of its chains. Steel mills in Pittsburgh ran all night, their furnaces never cooling. Textile factories in Massachusetts operated in multiple shifts. The economy expanded in a great leap forward, powered not by new resources or new markets, but simply by the addition of time. Electric light had added hours to the day, and those hours translated directly into wealth, growth, production. Cities transformed. Streets that had been dangerous after dark became safe, vibrant, alive. Commerce extended into evening hours. Shops stayed open. Restaurants thrived. Entertainment districts emerged. Broadway became the Great White Way, its theaters blazing with thousands of bulbs, creating a spectacle of light that drew people from around the world. Electric light didn't just illuminate darkness. It created new forms of culture, new patterns of social interaction, new economic opportunities. Night itself changed meaning. It was no longer a barrier to human activity but simply another time of day. The home, that most intimate of spaces, was revolutionized. Women could read at night without straining their eyes. Children could study after sunset. Families could gather in well-lit rooms instead of huddling around candles and oil lamps. The air quality improved dramatically. No more soot on walls, no more toxic fumes from burning kerosene, no more carbon monoxide poisoning from gas leaks. Electric light was clean, safe, reliable. It changed the texture of domestic life in ways subtle and profound. People slept better because they weren't breathing fumes all night. They lived longer because their homes weren't death traps of open flame and explosive gas. Hospitals could finally operate at night with confidence. Surgical theaters blazed with electric lights that didn't flicker, didn't cast dancing shadows, didn't fill operating rooms with smoke. Mortality rates from surgery dropped precipitously. Emergency medicine became truly possible. A child with appendicitis could be saved at 3 in the morning. A woman giving birth at midnight had the same chance of survival as one delivering at noon. Electric light didn't just improve medical care. It democratized survival across all hours of the day. But there was another story unfolding. A darker narrative that Edison and his contemporaries either didn't see or chose to ignore. Because electric light, like all transformative technologies, came with costs that weren't immediately visible, with consequences that would take decades to fully manifest. The coal that powered the generators that produced the electricity that lit the bulbs came from mines. Deep, dangerous mines where men worked in conditions that would be illegal today, where cave-ins and explosions killed thousands every year, where black lung disease claimed entire generations of families. Electric light was clean at the point of use, yes, but its origins were written in human suffering. The light in a Manhattan parlor was powered by the broken bodies of miners in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. That equation was rarely discussed. The distance between cause and effect, between consumption and extraction, allowed people to enjoy their electric lights without thinking about the price others paid to generate them. The factories that now ran 24 hours a day demanded workers for 24 hours a day. Night shifts became common. Men who had once slept when the sun went down now worked through darkness and artificial day, their circadian rhythms destroyed, their health deteriorating from lack of natural light and disrupted sleep patterns. The productivity gains that made factory owners wealthy came at the direct expense of worker well-being. Electric light had liberated industry from the constraint of daylight, but it had also liberated industry from one of the natural limits on exploitation. When darkness no longer stopped production, when the night shift became possible, workers lost one of their few defenses against endless labor. Cities grew brighter, but the stars disappeared. For the first time in human history, entire populations grew up never seeing the Milky Way. Light pollution spread from urban centers, a dome of artificial glow that obscured the cosmos. Something ancient and fundamental was lost. For millennia, humans had looked up at night and seen infinity. The stars had guided navigation, inspired philosophy, grounded humanity in the knowledge of our smallness in the universe. But electric light made the night sky invisible. Children in cities grew up thinking the sky contained maybe a dozen visible stars. The cosmos became abstract, theoretical, something you saw in books but never experienced directly. We gained control over our immediate environment and lost connection to everything beyond it. And then there was the war. Because every technology, no matter how benign its original purpose, eventually finds military application. Electric light allowed factories to produce weapons around the clock, allowed soldiers to fight at night, allowed interrogators to keep prisoners awake for days in brightly lit cells, using light itself as a form of torture. The First World War was fought under searchlights, in trenches illuminated by electric bulbs, with soldiers exhausted from sleepless nights under artificial suns designed to prevent enemy attacks. Electric light had promised liberation from darkness, but it also eliminated one of humanity's few refuges from observation and control. Edison himself wrestled with some of these contradictions, though not publicly. In his private notebooks, there are moments of doubt. Brief passages where he questions whether the world he was creating was truly better than the one he'd left behind. He wrote once, late at night in 1887, "Have I given humanity a gift or a burden? The light burns constantly now. There is no rest from it. No escape. I wonder if darkness was not, in its own way, a mercy we no longer possess." But these doubts never made it into his public statements. The Edison the world saw was confident, certain, always forward-looking. The private Edison, the one who appeared only in journals and letters, was more complicated, more human. The business of electricity also revealed the ruthless side of Edison's character. He waged a vicious war against alternating current, the competing electrical system championed by George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla. Edison's direct current system had limitations. It couldn't transmit power over long distances efficiently. Alternating current solved that problem, but Edison saw it as a threat to his patents, his investments, his empire. So he launched a propaganda campaign. He staged public electrocutions of animals using alternating current to prove it was dangerous. He lobbied for the electric chair to use alternating current, hoping to associate his competitors' technology with death. He spread fear and misinformation, all to protect his market share. The man who had brought light to the world was perfectly willing to use darkness of another kind, the darkness of manipulation and fear, to maintain his dominance. He lost that battle. Alternating current proved superior for large-scale power distribution, and eventually became the standard. Edison's direct current system, despite being his invention, despite being what he'd fought so hard to create, was relegated to niche applications. It must have stung. To see your life's work superseded by something technically better. To watch competitors succeed using principles you'd rejected. But that's the nature of progress. It doesn't care about individual egos or historical contributions. It moves toward whatever works best, trampling pioneers and prophets with equal indifference. Yet the light bulb itself, that simple glass sphere with a glowing filament, remained. Improved certainly. The bamboo filaments Edison used were replaced by tungsten in the early 1900s, lasting even longer, burning even brighter. But the fundamental principle, the basic design, stayed remarkably consistent for over a century. From 1907, when tungsten filaments were introduced, until the 21st century, billions of light bulbs were manufactured using essentially the same technology Edison had pioneered. That's legacy. Not the profits or the patents or the business empire, all of which eventually crumbled or were absorbed by other companies. But the thing itself, the idea made physical. The solution to darkness that worked so well it needed very little improvement for 100 years. The light bulb became more than just technology. It became symbol. In cartoons, in language, in culture, a light bulb over someone's head meant idea, inspiration, understanding. The moment of illumination, both literal and metaphorical, was represented by Edison's invention. That's influence beyond measure. When your creation becomes the universal symbol for human creativity itself, you've achieved a kind of immortality that transcends patents and profit margins. Other inventors built on what Edison started. Fluorescent lights in the 1930s, more efficient but harsher. Halogen bulbs in the 1950s, brighter and longer lasting. Compact fluorescent bulbs in the 1980s, energy-saving but unpopular for their cold light and slow warm-up times. And finally, LEDs, light-emitting diodes, which represented the biggest leap forward in lighting technology since Edison. LEDs used a fraction of the electricity, lasted tens of thousands of hours, produced almost no heat. They were everything the incandescent bulb wasn't. Efficient, durable, cool. And yet, people mourned the passing of incandescent bulbs when they were phased out in many countries. There was something about that warm glow, that familiar yellow light that felt like home. LED manufacturers actually had to engineer their lights to mimic the color temperature of Edison's bulbs, because pure white light felt wrong to people. We had become so accustomed to the specific quality of incandescent light that anything else felt artificial, even though LEDs were in many ways superior. The infrastructure Edison built evolved into the electrical grid, one of the most complex machines humanity has ever constructed. Power plants across continents connected by high-voltage transmission lines, stepping down through substations, feeding into neighborhoods, homes, every building, every room. The grid is so fundamental to modern life that we only notice it when it fails. A blackout doesn't just remove light. It removes refrigeration, communication, transportation, climate control, entertainment, work, connection. Everything stops. We discover in those dark moments just how completely dependent we've become on Edison's original insight. That electricity could be distributed like water through pipes, delivered on demand, always available, invisible until needed. His method, that brutal process of trial and error, that willingness to fail 1,000 times in pursuit of success, became part of entrepreneurial mythology. Startup culture worships Edison's persistence, his systematic approach to experimentation, his integration of research and manufacturing. Silicon Valley sees itself as the spiritual successor to Menlo Park, with every garage startup and laboratory incubator claiming Edison's legacy. Whether that's justified is debatable. Edison was creating physical products that solved concrete problems. Much of modern tech creates solutions in search of problems, apps and platforms that change quickly and break often. But the spirit, that relentless iteration, that belief that any problem can be solved with enough time and resources, that comes directly from Edison's example. The man himself died in 1931 at age 84, his body finally giving out after decades of abuse and neglect. In his final years he was an icon, a living legend, regularly visited by presidents and celebrities and fellow inventors. But he was also increasingly irrelevant. The world had moved beyond him. Radio was the exciting new technology. Edison didn't understand it, couldn't contribute to it. He'd become a relic of an earlier age, celebrated but no longer central. That's the fate of revolutionaries. They change the world and then the world moves on without them. When Edison died, President Herbert Hoover suggested that the entire nation turn off their electric lights for 1 minute in tribute. The idea was quickly abandoned. Not because it lacked poetic resonance but because it was impossible. By 1931, America was so dependent on electric power that even a single minute of darkness would have been catastrophic. Hospitals couldn't shut down. Factories couldn't stop. Traffic signals couldn't go dark. Trains couldn't halt. The infrastructure Edison had created was no longer optional, was essential. You cannot turn off civilization even for 60 seconds, to honor the man who made that civilization possible. Perhaps that was the truest measure of his impact. The world he created couldn't pause to mourn him. The light bulb continued its journey through the 20th century, becoming cheaper, more accessible, more ubiquitous. By the 1950s, electric light had penetrated even the most remote corners of the developed world. Rural electrification projects brought Edison's invention to farms and small towns that had still been using kerosene lamps into the 1940s. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the Rural Electrification Administration, massive government programs that strung power lines across thousands of miles of countryside, completing the transformation Edison had started 70 years earlier. Farm families who had lived exactly as their ancestors had lived for centuries, waking with the sun, sleeping with darkness, suddenly had lights, refrigerators, electric pumps. Their lives changed more in a single decade than in the previous 100 years. But the developing world was different. As late as the 1980s, billions of people still lived without electricity, still used candles and oil lamps, still structured their lives around daylight. The gap between the illuminated world and the dark world became another marker of inequality, another division between rich and poor, another way that accident of geography determined quality of life. A child born in Manhattan had electric light as a birthright, something so assumed it was invisible. A child born in rural India or sub-Saharan Africa grew up in the same darkness their ancestors had known, and that darkness meant less education, less opportunity, less connection to the modern world. The 21st century has seen an explosion of off-grid lighting solutions. Solar-powered LED lamps that can provide light in places where the electrical grid will never reach. Battery technology and photovoltaic cells converging to create lighting systems that cost dollars instead of thousands, that can be installed in a day instead of years. Organizations distribute these lights by the millions to communities in Africa, Asia, South America. Children can study after dark for the first time in their family's history. Not because massive infrastructure projects brought power lines to their villages, but because the technology became small enough, cheap enough, portable enough to bypass the grid entirely. Edison's solution required enormous systemic investment. The modern solution fits in a backpack. Both accomplish the same fundamental goal. Both push back the darkness. But the path has changed dramatically. And yet, even as lighting technology has advanced, we're discovering that our relationship with artificial light is more complicated than Edison or anyone else imagined. Medical research in the late 20th and early 21st centuries revealed that human biology is deeply intertwined with natural light cycles. Our circadian rhythms, our sleep patterns, our hormone production, our mental health, all of it regulated by the presence and absence of light. And artificial light, particularly the blue spectrum light emitted by LEDs and screens, disrupts those patterns in ways we're only beginning to understand. Sleep disorders have skyrocketed. Seasonal affective disorder, depression, anxiety. Some of it attributable to the fact that we're bathed in artificial light 16 hours a day, that our bedrooms are never truly dark, that our bodies never receive the clear signal that night has arrived and it's time to rest. Teenagers scrolling through phones at 2 in the morning, their faces illuminated by screens that their brains interpret as daylight, suppressing melatonin production, making sleep impossible. Adults working late into the night under bright office lights, then wondering why they can't fall asleep when they finally get home. The 24-hour casino, the all-night diner, the city that never sleeps, all of these made possible by electric light, and all of them carrying costs we're still calculating. Edison freed humanity from the tyranny of darkness, but he may have also severed our connection to something essential, some biological need for true darkness that we ignored in our rush toward constant illumination. Some scientists now advocate for darkness. For dark sky preserves where artificial light is prohibited, where people can experience night as their ancestors did. For regulations limiting light pollution. For redesigning cities to use light more judiciously, only where needed, allowing pockets of darkness to exist. There's a growing recognition that darkness isn't the enemy, that it serves purposes, that eliminating it entirely was hubris. The pendulum is swinging slowly toward a more nuanced understanding. Not a rejection of artificial light, but a more thoughtful relationship with it. Light when necessary. Darkness when possible. Balance. The environmental cost of electric lighting has also become impossible to ignore. The power plants that generate electricity for billions of lights still run primarily on fossil fuels. Coal. Natural gas. Edison's light bulb is connected, through a long chain of cause and effect, to carbon emissions, climate change, rising sea levels, extreme weather events. The light in your living room is powered, in part, by the destruction of the atmosphere. That's not hyperbole. That's thermodynamics and atmospheric chemistry. Every kilowatt-hour of electricity generated by burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. And lighting, globally, accounts for 15% of total electricity consumption. 15% of humanity's electrical demand is dedicated to pushing back darkness. That's a staggering number when you consider the consequences. The shift to LED technology has helped. LEDs use 80% less energy than incandescent bulbs. If the entire world switched to LEDs tomorrow, global electricity demand would drop significantly. Carbon emissions would fall. It would be one of the single most effective climate interventions available, and it requires no change in behavior, no sacrifice, just swapping one type of bulb for another. And yet, the transition has been slow. In many parts of the world, incandescent bulbs are still in use, still wasting energy, still contributing to warming simply because they're cheaper up front, even though they cost more to operate over time. The economics of poverty trap people in inefficient technology, perpetuating the problem. But even LED lights, efficient as they are, still require power. And until that power comes from truly renewable sources, solar and wind and hydroelectric, lighting remains complicit in environmental destruction. The irony is profound. Edison's invention was supposed to free humanity from dependence on combustion, on burning things to create light. But we simply shifted the combustion elsewhere to power plants instead of individual lamps. We made it more efficient, more centralized, but we didn't eliminate it. We're still fundamentally burning things to see in the dark, just at greater scale. Some futurists imagine a world where bioluminescence replaces electric light. Genetically engineered trees that glow, providing natural streetlights. Plants that produce their own illumination, making lamps obsolete. It sounds like science fiction, but the technology exists. Scientists have created glowing plants in laboratories, splicing genes from bioluminescent bacteria and jellyfish into ordinary houseplants. The light is faint, currently barely visible in a dark room. But it's real. And it represents a fundamentally different approach to the problem Edison solved. Not creating artificial light, but coaxing nature to provide it. Not fighting against biology, but working with it. Whether this vision will ever be practical at scale remains to be seen. But the fact that we're pursuing it suggests a recognition that the Edison model, generate and distribute electricity to power artificial lights, may not be the final answer. Maybe just one solution among many possible solutions. The cultural impact of Edison's light bulb extends beyond the practical and into the realm of metaphor and meaning. Think about how many songs reference lights. How many films use lighting as a storytelling device, darkness and illumination as visual representation of knowledge and ignorance, good and evil, hope and despair. Think about how we use light in language. I see the light. Enlightenment. In the dark. A bright idea. Our metaphors for understanding, for revelation, for knowledge itself, are all rooted in the visual experience of light replacing darkness. And while humans have always used light metaphorically, the ubiquity of artificial light has deepened and complicated these metaphors. When everyone experiences controllable light, when darkness becomes optional, the metaphors take on new dimensions. Religious architecture changed because of electric light. Cathedrals and mosques and temples had been designed for centuries to manipulate natural light, to create moments of divine illumination, shafts of sunlight through stained glass creating transcendent experiences. But when you can flip a switch and flood a space with light, when you can control intensity and color and direction, the relationship between architecture and light fundamentally shifts. Modern churches are often brightly lit, evenly illuminated, functional spaces where mystery has been replaced by visibility. Something was gained in terms of practicality. Something was lost in terms of awe. The darkness that once amplified candlelight, that made a single flame seem miraculous, is gone. And with it, perhaps, some of the psychological impact of religious spaces. Photography and film are art forms that literally could not exist without artificial light. Oh, you can photograph in natural light, certainly. But the vast majority of photography, everything from studio portraits to Hollywood movies, depends on controlled artificial lighting. Cinematographers are really lighting designers. They paint with light, sculpting faces and spaces, creating mood and meaning through the precise application of illumination. Edison's invention didn't just make these art forms possible. It shaped their entire aesthetic language. Film noir, with its hard shadows and dramatic contrast, is a direct product of early studio lighting technology. The soft, even lighting of sitcoms, designed to eliminate shadows and present a cheerful, unthreatening world, is only possible with multiple artificial light sources. Every image you see on a screen is the descendant of Edison's bulb. Fashion shows, art galleries, retail stores, all of these depend on sophisticated lighting to function. The color of clothing looks different under different lights. The texture of a painting changes with illumination angle. The appeal of products on a shelf is manipulated by lighting designers who understand how to make things look desirable. We live in a world where appearance is constantly managed through artificial light, where what we see is never purely natural, always mediated through Edison's technology. That has implications for authenticity, for truth, for how we understand reality itself. When everything is lit to look its best, when shadows are eliminated and flaws are hidden, we lose touch with the unadorned truth of things. Yet there's also something deeply human about our desire to control light, to banish darkness, to see clearly, to extend our waking hours, to create beauty through illumination. You can criticize the costs and consequences all you want, but the fact remains that given the choice between darkness and light, humans choose light. Every time. In every culture. Throughout all of history. We are phototropic creatures. We move toward light. We create it when we can. We worship it. We fear its absence. Edison didn't create that impulse. He just gave us the technology to fulfill it more completely than ever before. His notebooks survive. Thousands of pages preserved in archives, museums, private collections. They're remarkable documents. Not because they contain revolutionary insights or elegant theories, but because they're records of process. Page after page of failed experiments. Sketches of designs that didn't work. Lists of materials tried and rejected. Numbers. Measurements. Observations written in Edison's cramped handwriting, often late at night, exhaustion bleeding through in irregular script and crossed-out words. These notebooks reveal something the triumphant narrative of genius inventor obscures. They show us that breakthrough doesn't happen in a flash of inspiration. It happens through accumulated micro-failures, each one teaching something, narrowing possibilities, eliminating dead ends until only the solution remains. Edison's genius wasn't that he was smarter than everyone else. It was that he was more systematic, more stubborn, more willing to document failure as carefully as success, because he understood that failure contained information. Modern innovation tries to replicate his method. Research and development departments, rapid prototyping, B testing, iteration cycles. The language has changed, but the principle remains Edison's. Try things, measure results, adjust, repeat. The startup mantra "fail fast" is just Edison's approach repackaged for the digital age. But there's a crucial difference. Edison was working with physical reality, with materials that had properties, with problems that had solutions if you could just find them. Much of modern innovation is in software, in business models, in social platforms. The problems are different. The constraints are different. You can't just try 1,000 variations of a social media algorithm and expect one to solve loneliness or polarization. Some problems aren't technical. Some problems are human. And human problems rarely yield to the brute force method that worked so well for Edison's light bulb. Still, his example endures. Because what he proved, fundamentally, was that complex problems can be solved through systematic effort. That you don't need to understand everything before you begin. That you can feel your way forward, learning as you go, building knowledge through experimentation. This is now so deeply embedded in scientific and engineering culture that we forget it was once controversial. In Edison's time, many scientists believed you needed complete theoretical understanding before attempting practical application. Edison proved you could reverse that. You could build things that worked without fully understanding why they worked, and then develop the theory later. This was revolutionary. It democratized innovation. You didn't need a PhD to invent. You needed curiosity, persistence, resources, and a tolerance for failure. But it also created problems. The emphasis on practical results over theoretical understanding means we sometimes build technologies whose long-term consequences we can't predict. We create things that work without fully grasping how they'll interact with complex systems. Social media platforms are a perfect example. They work technically. They achieve their immediate goals of connecting people and distributing information. But their systemic effects on mental health, on political discourse, on truth itself, weren't understood until it was too late. Edison's light bulb had unintended consequences too, but they were relatively benign compared to what's possible now. The Edison method, applied to technologies of greater complexity and reach, can create monsters we don't know how to control. The patent wars that followed Edison's invention were brutal and prolonged. He filed over 1,000 patents in his lifetime, and defended them aggressively. Other inventors who claimed they'd developed similar technologies were sued, intimidated, driven into bankruptcy. Edison understood that in capitalism, innovation without protection is worthless. You can invent the future, but if you can't control it legally, someone else will profit from your work. This created a tension at the heart of technological progress. On one hand, patents incentivize innovation by guaranteeing inventors can profit from their discoveries. On the other hand, patents create monopolies that can stifle further innovation by making it expensive or impossible to build on existing technologies. Edison was both beneficiary and victim of this system. His patents made him wealthy and powerful. Other people's patents blocked some of his ideas and forced him to find workarounds or pay licensing fees. The modern tech industry has amplified this tension to absurd levels. Patent trolls who don't invent anything but buy patents and sue actual innovators. Companies building defensive patent portfolios, filing for patents on obvious ideas just to prevent competitors from doing so. The system has become perverted, serving lawyers more than inventors. Edison would recognize the game but might be appalled at its current form. He used patents strategically but still believed in invention, in creating things. The modern patent system often seems detached from actual innovation, existing in a legal realm where ideas are property to be traded and weaponized regardless of whether anyone builds them. The Menlo Park Laboratory itself became a model for industrial research. Before Edison, inventors typically worked alone or in small partnerships. Edison created the first true research team, with specialists in different areas collaborating under one roof, with shared equipment and resources, working toward common goals. This model was adopted by corporations throughout the 20th century. General Electric, Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, IBM Research. Corporate research and development as an institution traces directly back to Edison's innovation in how to organize innovation itself. He didn't just invent products. He invented a process for inventing, a system for discovery. That may be his most lasting legacy. Bell Labs, in particular, became the apotheosis of this model. Thousands of researchers, billions in funding, decades of sustained effort producing the transistor, the laser, information theory, the Unix operating system, cellular telephone technology. Bell Labs invented the future wholesale, and they did it by scaling up Edison's approach. More people, more resources, more time, more systematic exploration of possibility space. But Bell Labs is mostly gone now, broken up, defunded, absorbed into other entities. Corporate research and development has declined across most industries. Companies now prefer to let universities do basic research, or buy startups that have already de-risked innovations. The patient, long-term, systematic approach to invention that Edison pioneered and Bell Labs perfected is increasingly rare. Quarterly earnings reports don't reward decade-long research projects with uncertain outcomes. Shareholder capitalism has shortened time horizons to the point where Edison's 1,000 failures would never be tolerated. He'd be fired after the first 100. This is a crisis that few people talk about. We're consuming the seed corn of innovation, living off breakthroughs made decades ago. The smartphone you're holding contains technologies invented between 1940 and 1990. The transistor, the microprocessor, lithium-ion batteries, touchscreens, GPS, the internet. Most of these came from long-term research projects funded by governments or corporations with patience. We've gotten very good at refining and miniaturizing these technologies, at combining them in new ways. But genuine breakthroughs, fundamental advances that open new possibility spaces, have slowed. Not because we're running out of things to discover, but because we've dismantled the institutions that made discovery possible. Edison built a machine for making discoveries. We're letting that machine rust. There are exceptions. SpaceX, OpenAI. A handful of companies and research institutions still committed to long-term moonshots. But they're exceptions that prove the rule. And even they operate differently than Edison did. They're venture-funded or billionaire-funded, dependent on individual visionaries with enough capital to ignore market pressures. That's not sustainable. It's not scalable. We need systematic innovation infrastructure, not heroic individuals. Edison understood this. That's why he built a team, a laboratory, a process. One person can have a breakthrough, but only organizations can have sustained breakthroughs over time. We've forgotten this lesson. We've re-romanticized the lone inventor, the garage startup, the visionary founder. And in doing so, we've made ourselves vulnerable. Because the challenges we face now, climate change, pandemic preparedness, artificial intelligence alignment, require sustained, systematic, collaborative innovation on a scale that makes Edison's 1,000 attempts look like a warm-up exercise. The light bulb still burns. Not Edison's version, not anymore, but its descendants. In some form, in some technology, the solution to darkness persists. That's the test of a true innovation. Not whether it makes someone rich. Not whether it wins awards. But whether it survives. Whether it gets incorporated into the fabric of human civilization so thoroughly that its absence becomes unthinkable. By that measure, Edison's light bulb is among the most successful inventions in human history. We've built our entire world assuming its existence. Our cities, our homes, our schedules, our economy, all of it predicated on the availability of light on demand. That's power. Not the power of electricity, though that too, but the power to reshape human reality, to change what's possible, to alter the fundamental constraints within which civilization operates. Edison didn't just invent a product. He changed the rules of existence. And yet he remains a contested figure. History has complicated its view of Thomas Edison. The heroic narrative, the lone genius battling darkness, has given way to something more nuanced and uncomfortable. We know now about his treatment of competitors. His propaganda campaigns against alternating current that bordered on the sadistic, electrocuting animals to prove a point, using fear as a marketing tool. We know about his relationship with Nikola Tesla, how he exploited the brilliant Serbian inventor's work, promised him money and recognition, then reneged. We know about the racism embedded in some of his public statements, the casual bigotry common to his era but still inexcusable. We know about the workers in his factories, the conditions they endured, the wages he paid that were often barely enough to survive on while he accumulated massive wealth. Edison the man was not Edison the myth. He was complicated, flawed, sometimes cruel, often selfish, occasionally magnanimous, fully human. This doesn't erase his achievements, but it contextualizes them. The light bulb didn't emerge from pure genius operating in isolation. It emerged from a system that exploited workers, extracted resources, consolidated power, rewarded ruthlessness as much as innovation. Edison succeeded partly because he was brilliant and persistent, yes, but also because he was willing to do things other people weren't, to take credit that should have been shared, to destroy competitors who stood in his way, to build an empire on the backs of people whose names we'll never know, assistants and workers and craftsmen whose contributions were absorbed into the Edison brand and forgotten. The great man theory of history is comforting. It's also incomplete. Edison didn't create the light bulb alone. He created a system that allowed him to receive credit for it alone. There's a difference. Modern scholarship has worked to recover some of those lost names. Lewis Latimer, the African-American inventor who improved the carbon filament and made bulbs commercially viable for black communities, Edison largely ignored. William Hammer, who did much of the actual experimental work in Edison's laboratory. Francis Gell, Francis Upton, John Croce, Charles Batchelor, all of them essential to the light bulb's development, all of them reduced to footnotes in the Edison story. This is the pattern of history. Individuals get credit for collective achievements. The narrative demands heroes, so we create them even when the truth is more collaborative and messy. Correcting this narrative doesn't diminish Edison's role, but it expands our understanding. It shows us that breakthrough is usually a team effort, even when only one name makes it into the history books. The women in Edison's life remain even more obscure. His first wife Mary, who raised his children essentially as a single mother while he obsessed over his inventions, who died young of what was likely a morphine overdose, Whether accidental or intentional, we'll never know. His second wife Mina, who managed his public image, who turned him into a brand, who understood that Edison the symbol was more valuable than Edison the person. These women's labor, emotional and practical, made Edison's work possible. They created the stability that allowed him to disappear into his laboratory for days at a time. They managed households, raised children, maintained social connections, performed the invisible work that enabled visible achievement. History barely records their names. That's not Edison's fault specifically. That's systemic erasure of women's contributions across all of history. But it's worth noting when we tell the Edison story. Worth remembering that the light bulb had mothers as well as a father. The question of whether we should separate the artist from the art, the inventor from the invention, is eternal and unresolvable. Can we celebrate the light bulb while condemning some of Edison's actions? Can we acknowledge his genius while also acknowledging his cruelty? Can we hold both truths simultaneously? We have to. Because the alternative is either hagiography or cancellation, and neither serves understanding. Edison was brilliant and flawed. His inventions changed the world for better and worse. He liberated humanity from darkness and created new forms of exploitation. All of this is true. All of it matters. The complexity is the point. History is not a morality play with clear heroes and villains. It's a complicated tapestry where the threads of progress and oppression are often woven together so tightly they become inseparable. The developing world offers a different perspective on Edison's legacy. In villages across Africa and Asia, the arrival of electric light is still happening now in the 21st century. And when it arrives, whether through grid extension or solar panels or batteries, the transformation is immediate and profound. Children's test scores improve because they can study at night. Women's safety increases because streets are lit. Small businesses can operate longer hours. Health clinics can function after dark. The benefits that the developed world has taken for granted for over a century are still new, still revolutionary, in places where darkness was sovereign until recently. From this perspective, Edison's invention is not a historical artifact but a living, ongoing transformation. The project he started in 1879 isn't finished. Billions of people still live in darkness. The work continues. And perhaps that's the most important lesson. Innovation is not a moment but a process. Edison's successful bulb in 1879 was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. The beginning of an infrastructure build-out that took decades. The beginning of a technological evolution that continues today. The beginning of social and economic transformations we're still navigating. When we talk about Edison inventing the light bulb, we're using shorthand for something much larger and more complex. He didn't invent light. He didn't even invent electric light. He invented a system that made electric light practical, affordable, scalable. And that system had implications far beyond illumination. It was about power generation, distribution networks, manufacturing processes, business models, regulatory frameworks. It was about creating an entirely new technological ecosystem. The bulb was just the visible part. Just the tip of an enormous infrastructure iceberg. This is what modern innovators often miss. They focus on the product, the app, the device. But products without systems are toys. Edison understood systems. He thought holistically about how electricity would be generated, distributed, measured, paid for. He considered manufacturing, installation, maintenance, customer service. He built vertically integrated companies that controlled every aspect of the process. This comprehensive thinking is rare now. We've specialized so much that few people can see the whole system. We have brilliant software engineers who don't understand hardware. Hardware designers who don't understand manufacturing. Manufacturing experts who don't understand markets. Everyone optimizing their small piece, no one responsible for the whole. Edison's approach was the opposite. He insisted on understanding everything, controlling everything when possible. That made him a monopolist and a control freak. It also made him effective in ways that are hard to replicate in our fragmented, specialized world. The energy grid he started building is now one of humanity's most critical and vulnerable infrastructures. Cyber attacks target power systems. Climate change stresses them with extreme weather and increased demand. Aging equipment fails. The grid that seems so permanent, so reliable, is actually fragile. Dependent on constant maintenance, constant investment, constant vigilance. And in many places, that investment isn't happening. The American electrical grid averages over 50 years old. Much of it dates to Edison's era or shortly after. It's literally falling apart. And we're asking it to do things it was never designed for. Charge millions of electric vehicles. Handle distributed solar generation. Accommodate rapidly fluctuating demand from data centers and cryptocurrency mining. The system is straining. Blackouts are becoming more common. California, Texas, the entire eastern seaboard. Rolling blackouts that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago are now routine in some places. Edison built something magnificent. We failed to maintain it, failed to upgrade it, failed to treat it with the seriousness it deserves. And now we're paying the price. Darkness returns, not because we lack the technology to prevent it, but because we lack the will to invest in infrastructure that we only notice when it fails. There's a psychological dimension to this that we rarely discuss. Humans evolved with darkness. For millions of years, our ancestors experienced true night. Their nervous systems developed in rhythm with light and dark cycles. Their brains produced melatonin when darkness fell. Their bodies prepared for sleep, for rest, for the vulnerability that comes with reduced visibility. This wasn't just biology. It was existential. Night was when predators hunted, when danger increased, when humans huddled together for safety and told stories and stared at fires and felt the immense weight of the unknown pressing in from all sides. Darkness shaped human consciousness, our fears, our religions, our myths. The underworld was always dark. Heaven was always light. Good and evil mapped onto this fundamental binary. And then Edison flipped the switch and suddenly darkness became optional. What did that do to us? What does it mean when one of the most ancient human experiences, the nightly surrender to darkness, simply disappears? Some psychologists argue it's made us more anxious. That without the natural break darkness provided, without the forced cessation of activity that night imposed, humans have lost a crucial mechanism for rest and recovery. We work too much. We stimulate ourselves too much. We never fully disengage. The phone glows beside the bed. The street light shines through the window. The city never sleeps, and increasingly neither do we. Sleep deprivation is epidemic in developed nations. Chronic, grinding exhaustion that no amount of coffee can truly fix. Is Edison's light bulb partly responsible? It's impossible to draw direct causal lines, but the correlation is suggestive. The more artificial light in a society, the less sleep its citizens get. Japan, South Korea, the United States, all of them blazing with light all night. All of them reporting massive sleep deficits in their populations. But there's another side. The liberation. Think of the woman who can read after her husband goes to sleep, who can educate herself, who can escape into books and ideas in the privacy of night. Think of the artist who works best in the quiet hours after midnight, who needs darkness outside and light inside to create. Think of the emergency room doctor who can save a life at 3 in the morning. Think of the astronomer studying distant galaxies, using artificial light to document the natural light that traveled billions of years to reach us. Think of the baker starting work at 4 a.m., preparing bread for the morning rush. Think of all the human activity, all the productivity and creativity and necessity that happens in hours that used to be impossible. Edison's gift was time. He gave humanity back half the day. What we choose to do with that time, whether we use it wisely or squander it, whether it enriches us or exhausts us, that's on us. The tool is neutral. We determine its impact by how we wield it. The environmental movement has begun to reckon seriously with light pollution. Not just as an aesthetic issue, not just about seeing stars, but as an ecological disaster. Migratory birds navigate by starlight and moonlight. City lights confuse them, lead them off course, cause them to collide with buildings. Sea turtle hatchlings instinctively move toward the brightest light, which used to be the moon reflecting on the ocean but is now often beachfront hotels and condos, leading the babies away from safety and toward death. Insects are decimated by artificial lights, disrupting entire food chains. Bats, crucial pollinators and pest controllers, avoid lit areas, reducing their range and effectiveness. The ecological cost of our illuminated world is staggering and still being calculated. We've changed the fundamental sensory environment of the planet, altered the conditions under which life evolved. And we did it in roughly a century, which is geological instant, evolutionary blink, no time at all for species to adapt. Some cities are experimenting with solutions. Dimming street lights in the small hours of the morning. Using amber lights instead of blue-white LEDs because amber affects animal behavior less. Creating dark corridors for wildlife migration. Installing motion sensors so lights only activate when needed. These are small steps, but they represent a recognition that light, like any resource, should be used thoughtfully rather than wastefully. That more is not always better. That darkness has value. This would have been heresy in Edison's time, when light was purely good and darkness purely evil. But we've learned. We've seen the consequences of our illuminated world. And we're trying haltingly, imperfectly to find balance. The latest frontier is controllable light. Smart bulbs that adjust color temperature throughout the day, mimicking natural sunlight cycles. Warmer light in the evening to promote melatonin production. Cooler light in the morning to wake you up. Light is medicine. Light is therapy. We're coming full circle in a way, recognizing that the quality and timing of light matters as much as its mere presence. Edison gave us the ability to create light. Now we're learning to create the right kind of light at the right time. This is progress, but it's also admission. Admission that the crude binary of light versus dark that Edison's invention offered isn't sufficient. That we need nuance, gradation, sophistication. The first generation of any technology is always simple. On or off. Light or dark. Later generations refine. They add complexity. They account for unintended consequences. We're in that refinement phase now with lighting. Learning to use Edison's gift more wisely than he could have imagined was necessary. In some ways, the story of the light bulb is the story of all technology. Invention, adoption, unintended consequences, refinement, backlash, integration. It follows a pattern that repeats with automobiles, with computers, with social media. Initial enthusiasm. This will solve everything. This will make life better. Then reality intrudes. Oh, cars create pollution and traffic and sprawl. Computers enable surveillance and isolation. Social media spreads misinformation and depression. And then, if we're lucky, if we're thoughtful, we begin to adapt, to regulate, to redesign, to figure out how to keep the benefits while mitigating the harms. We're still in the middle of this process with most technologies, still figuring out how to live with the tools we've created, still learning that every solution creates new problems. That progress is not linear but dialectical. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Edison gave us light. We discovered its cost. Now we're working toward synthesis, toward a relationship with artificial light that's sustainable and humane and wise. But here's what remains undeniable. Given the choice, humans choose light. Always. In every context. Every culture. When villages get electricity for the first time, they celebrate. They don't mourn the loss of darkness. They rejoice in its defeat. Whatever abstract concerns intellectuals might have about light pollution or circadian rhythms, people living in darkness just want lights. They want to see. They want their children to study. They want safety. They want modernity. And modernity, for better or worse, is bright. This tells us something fundamental about human nature. We are creatures who seek understanding, and understanding requires perception, and perception requires light. Metaphorically and literally. The Enlightenment wasn't called that by accident. The association between light and knowledge is deep, primal, probably hardwired into our evolutionary psychology. Edison didn't create that association. He just gave us the technology to fulfill it more completely than ever before. His face is not widely recognized anymore. Ask a teenager who invented the light bulb and you might get a blank stare. The name Edison might ring a bell, vaguely, something from a history class half remembered. But the thing itself, the glowing filament in a glass bulb, that's universal. That's iconic. That's embedded so deeply in visual culture that it transcends its inventor. The idea of Edison matters more than the man. The persistence, the systematic approach, the 1,000 failures transformed into success. That story is told to children, printed in textbooks, referenced in motivational speeches. Whether it's historically accurate in all its details doesn't matter. It's become myth. And myths serve purposes that transcend factual precision. They teach. They inspire. They provide models for behavior. The Edison myth tells us that perseverance matters. That failure is not final. That complex problems can be solved with systematic effort. These are good lessons, worth preserving. Even if the man himself was more complicated than the myth suggests. The factories of Menlo Park are gone now. Demolished decades ago. The site is a museum, a historical marker, a place where tourists take photos and learn about the past. But the impact radiates outward still, spreading through time and space in ways that would have astonished Edison himself. Every light bulb ever manufactured traces its lineage back to those desperate experiments in 1879. Every electrical grid in every city carries forward the systematic thinking he pioneered. Every research laboratory with teams of specialists working toward common goals follows the organizational model he created. The physical evidence of his work has mostly vanished. The legacy is everywhere. Consider what the world would look like if he had failed. If after 1,000 attempts, after exhausting his money and his reputation and his health, Edison had simply given up. Someone else would have eventually solved the problem, certainly. Swan or Maxim or some inventor whose name we never learned. But how much later? 5 years? 10? 20? And what would those years have cost? How many lives lost in gas explosions, in fires started by candles and oil lamps? How many children's education stunted by lack of light to study? How many medical breakthroughs delayed because surgery remained dangerous after dark? The counterfactual is impossible to calculate precisely, but the magnitude is clear. Edison's refusal to quit, his pathological persistence, his 1,000 failures transformed into one success, that stubbornness changed the trajectory of human civilization, bent the arc of history toward light. That's not hyperbole. That's measurable, quantifiable impact on billions of lives across more than a century. But let's also sit with the darkness of it. The miners who died extracting coal to power his lights. The workers in his factories who earned poverty wages while he became wealthy. The competitors he destroyed through legal warfare and propaganda. The assistants whose contributions were erased. The natural world disrupted by light pollution and power generation. The sleep-deprived populations of the modern world. The cultural loss of true darkness, of star-filled skies, of the ancient human experience of night. All of this is also part of Edison's legacy. All of it must be reckoned with. You cannot celebrate the light without acknowledging the shadows it creates. You cannot tell the story of triumph without the tragedy that accompanied it. This is the brutal arithmetic of progress. Every advance costs something. Every solution creates new problems. And the people who pay the costs are rarely the people who reap the benefits. Edison himself, in his final years, seemed to understand this better than he had in his youth. His late interviews contain moments of reflection, of doubt, of wondering whether the world he'd helped create was truly better. He watched the First World War, fought partially under electric lights, powered by the electrical grids he'd pioneered. He saw the inequality persist, the rich getting richer in the electrified world while the poor still struggled. He witnessed the environmental degradation that came with industrialization. And while he never publicly questioned his life's work, privately he seemed less certain, less triumphant, more aware of complexity, more human. The prophet of progress confronting the messy reality of the future he'd created. There's a photograph of him from 1928, 3 years before his death. He's sitting in his laboratory, an old man now, surrounded by equipment, his face deeply lined, eyes tired but still sharp. He's holding a light bulb. Not one of his original carbon filament bulbs, but a modern tungsten bulb. Better than what he'd created. Longer lasting. More efficient. The product of decades of further innovation building on his foundation. And his expression in that photograph is complex. Pride certainly. But also something else. Recognition, perhaps, that his invention had outgrown him. That it belonged to the world now, not to him. That history would judge not just the creation but its consequences. And those consequences were still unfolding, would continue unfolding long after he was gone. He died at 3:24 in the morning, October 18, 1931. The darkness he'd fought his entire life finally claimed him in the small hours when electricity couldn't help, when no amount of light could push back the darkness that comes for everyone eventually. His last words, allegedly, were to his wife Mina. "It is very beautiful over there. Beautiful over there." Where? No one knows. Perhaps he was hallucinating. Perhaps he was seeing something beyond the physical world. Perhaps it was just the morphine talking, meaningless sounds from a dying brain. But it's poetic, isn't it? That the man who spent his life creating light, who waged war on darkness, who gave humanity the power to illuminate the night, spoke of beauty somewhere else. Somewhere beyond light and dark. Somewhere beyond the binary he'd spent his life trying to control. The obituaries were massive. Front-page news around the world. Presidents issued statements. Fellow inventors paid tribute. But the most meaningful memorial came from ordinary people. From the millions who simply turned on their lights that evening and thought, for just a moment, about where that light came from. About the man who'd made it possible. About the persistence and the failures and the ultimate triumph. That's legacy. Not monuments or museums or statues. But utility. Being so woven into the fabric of daily life that your absence would be immediately, catastrophically felt. Edison achieved that. Achieved immortality not through fame but through necessity. The world cannot function without the infrastructure he pioneered. Cannot imagine existence without the gift he gave. That's power beyond measure. And yet, standing here in the 21st century with all our sophisticated lighting technology, with our LEDs and our smart bulbs and our dawn simulators, with all our knowledge about circadian rhythms and light pollution and sustainability, we face a question Edison never had to answer. What comes after light? What's the next frontier? If Edison solved the problem of darkness, what unsolved problem will define our era? What's our 1,000 failures? What's our impossible challenge that nevertheless must be overcome? Climate change, perhaps. The existential threat that requires global cooperation, systematic innovation, and persistence on a scale that makes Edison's efforts look quaint. Or artificial intelligence alignment, figuring out how to create thinking machines that help rather than harm humanity. Or pandemic preparedness, building systems robust enough to handle the next plague. Or simply justice, creating societies where the benefits of technology are shared equitably rather than concentrated in the hands of the few. These problems are harder than Edison's. More complex. More interconnected. Less amenable to brute force experimentation. You can't just try 1,000 different approaches to climate change and see which one works. You can't build 1,000 different societies and compare results. The stakes are higher. The timeline is shorter. The margin for error is smaller. And yet, the Edison example still matters. Because it teaches us something fundamental about human capability. It teaches us that impossible is often just a failure of imagination or effort or persistence. That complex problems can be broken down into smaller problems. That systematic experimentation, careful documentation, and willingness to fail can eventually produce solutions. That individual brilliance matters less than organizational capacity. That innovation is a process, not a moment. But it also teaches us about cost, about unintended consequences, about the need to think holistically, to consider not just whether we can do something but whether we should, and what the full implications might be. Edison didn't think this way. He couldn't have. He was operating in a simpler time with simpler technologies. We don't have that luxury. The technologies we're creating now, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, they have the potential to transform humanity even more profoundly than electric light did. And unlike the light bulb, they might transform us in ways we can't reverse, can't control, can't predict. So we need Edison's persistence combined with wisdom he didn't possess. We need systematic innovation tempered by ethical consideration. We need progress that learns from the past rather than repeating its mistakes. The light bulb represents a moment when humanity grabbed a piece of the divine. Fire had always been the god's domain. Prometheus stealing it from Olympus. Moses encountering God in the burning bush. Light as sacred, as beyond human control. And then Edison, this partially deaf man with a 6th grade education and an obsessive personality, working in a laboratory in New Jersey, created light from nothing but human ingenuity and electric current. He didn't steal it from the gods. He made it himself. That's the deeper meaning. That's what the story is really about. Human agency. Human capability. The power of mortals to reshape reality through thought and effort and refusal to accept limitations. Edison's 1,000 failures are really 1,000 acts of defiance. 1,000 times he told the universe, "No, this problem can be solved. I will solve it. I will persist until reality bends to my will." And he was right. Reality did bend. Darkness retreated. And nothing was ever the same. We stand now in a world Edison made possible but couldn't have imagined. A world where his invention has evolved beyond recognition. Where the simple incandescent bulb has been replaced by technologies that would seem like magic to him. Where light is programmable, controllable, tailored to individual needs and preferences. Where we're beginning to understand not just how to create light but how to create the right light for the right purpose at the right time. This is progress. Real, measurable, meaningful progress. But it's progress that carries his DNA. His systematic approach. His refusal to accept impossibility. His understanding that technology must be practical, affordable, integrated into existing systems. These principles remain valid even as the specific technologies change. There's a temptation looking back at Edison to see his era as simpler. To imagine that solving the problem of darkness was straightforward compared to the challenges we face today. This is nostalgia masquerading as analysis. Edison's problem was not simple. It was enormously complex, involving chemistry, physics, materials science, manufacturing, business strategy, infrastructure development, regulatory navigation. It required insights across multiple domains. It demanded skills both technical and managerial. It needed money, time, personnel, equipment, facilities. The fact that he succeeded makes it look inevitable in retrospect. But it wasn't. It was desperately difficult, and most people who tried failed. Edison succeeded not because he was smarter than everyone else but because he was more systematic, more persistent, more willing to document failures and learn from them. These are not innate traits. They're choices, habits, practices, which means they can be learned, can be cultivated, can be applied to the challenges of our own era. The light from Edison's first successful bulb has long since faded. The specific photons that illuminated Menlo Park on that October evening in 1879 dispersed into the universe seconds after being created, traveling at light speed toward oblivion. But the idea of that light, the possibility it represented, that continues to shine. It shines in every electric light burning right now, billions of them, scattered across the planet like terrestrial stars, pushing back darkness just as Edison dreamed. It shines in every research laboratory where scientists pursue seemingly impossible goals with systematic determination. It shines in every entrepreneur who refuses to quit despite repeated failures. It shines in every person who looks at a problem and thinks, "This can be solved. I can solve it. I just need to keep trying." And perhaps that's the real gift Edison left us. Not the light bulb itself, though that was revolutionary enough, but the example, the proof of concept, the demonstration that human beings, armed with nothing but curiosity and coffee and an inability to accept defeat, can solve problems that seem insurmountable, can change the world, can bend reality, can create futures that previous generations couldn't imagine. Every time you flip a switch and light floods a room, you're not just using Edison's technology. You're participating in his vision. His belief that darkness, both literal and metaphorical, both physical and intellectual, can be overcome through systematic human effort. That we are not prisoners of circumstance but architects of possibility. That the future is not something that happens to us but something we create, one experiment at a time, one failure at a time, until finally, impossibly, inevitably, the darkness retreats and the light breaks through. In the end, after all the complexity, after acknowledging all the costs and consequences, after wrestling with the full moral weight of Edison's legacy, we're left with something simple, something profound, something that transcends individual achievement and speaks to the deepest human impulse. We are the species that makes light, that refuses to accept darkness, that takes the raw materials of the universe, elements forged in dying stars, and arranges them into patterns that glow. We are the creatures who looked at the night sky and decided we could do that too, could create our own stars, could illuminate our own worlds, could take control of something as fundamental as light itself. Edison's 1,000 failures were not really about light bulbs. They were about what it means to be human, to struggle against limitations, to fail and fail and fail and keep going anyway, to transform impossibility into mere difficulty, difficulty into challenge, challenge into opportunity, and finally, after enough tries, to watch something that never existed before flicker into being and know that you made that happen, that you brought something new into the world, that you changed what's possible. That's the story, not just of the light bulb, but of us, of what we're capable of when we refuse to quit. When we treat failure as information rather than verdict. When we persist not because success is guaranteed but because the alternative, accepting darkness, is unthinkable. Edison survived 1,000 brutal failures not because he was superhuman but because he was profoundly human. Because he embodied the trait that perhaps defines humanity more than any other. The stubborn, foolish, magnificent refusal to accept the world as it is when we can imagine it being better. The insistence, against all evidence, against all odds, that one more try might be the one that works. That light is possible. That progress is achievable. That the darkness, however vast and ancient and powerful, can be pushed back, one small flame at a time, until finally the entire world is burning bright. And in every room, in every city, in every corner of the earth where electric light now shines, his answer echoes still. Persistent. Undeniable, luminous, the answer to the question that haunted humanity for millennia. The answer written not in words but in light itself. The answer that says, darkness does not have to win. We can create light. We did create light. And once created, once brought into being through nothing but human will and ingenuity and refusal to surrender, that light spreads, illuminating everything, changing everything. Making everything possible that darkness once forbade. That was Edison's gift. That is his legacy. Not perfect, not simple, but transformative, enduring, and burning still.